do a muting from the IT desk, yeah.
The moment there are two persons on unmute, the audio goes for a toss.
That's true.
Yeah, otherwise. Soumitra, where are you today? Are you in office or home?
I'm at home, but you can't make out because CIA has given me a background.
I know. So we should get all of us should get this background. You should, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, Maru. This is Vasudevan here from DHL.
Maru, welcome, Vasudevan. Nitin, you are there?
Thank you, Dada.
Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Hi, Saugat.
Hi. Good morning, Nitin.
Nitin here. Good morning.
Hi, Mr. Kapadia. Good morning. Mr. Kapadia.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning, Saugat. Mahesh Desai here.
Mr. Desai, good morning.
Good morning, Sudhir.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Bali. Good morning, Mr. Bhattacharya.
Morning, Mr. Kapadia. How are you doing?
Fine. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Mr. Kapadia, your backlog is for some other conference. Mr. Kapadia.
Let me check.
Yeah, some other conference, so it will get some confusion maybe. 19th October.
उसको न्यूट्रल कर दीजिए सुधीर.
Yeah.
Morning, Kamal. Ashok here. You're looking very smart, my friend.
Good morning, sir. Saugat here.
Morning, Shaugat.
Morning, Ashok. Nice to see you, Ashok.
Ashok, hi. Soumitra here. थोड़ा सा चेंज कर दीजिए सेंटेंस. Kamal always looks smart.
अच्छा.
Corrected, my friend. I stand corrected. Good correction.
You're looking smart today. यानी दूसरा दिन question mark. He always looks smart.
Soumitra is fishing for compliments now.
He was always smart and good looking. There's no doubt about that.
मैं आपके बारे बोल रहा हूँ कमल. आप और अशोक.
No. I'm too old for this, Thomas Rowe.
Soumitra, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear, visible and clear.
Yeah. In between.
So
there was some bad news.
Since our session is now live on the CII Hive and also the YouTube, we'll have to mute everybody now.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Okay. Marut, we can't hear you.
Yes, please.
Marut, you'll have to let us know when we start.
Yeah, since we are just waiting for the Chief Economic Advisor, Mr. Jory, to join, we are live just now, so we are putting everybody on mute. The session is just now live on the CII Hive as also on YouTube. So we're just putting the thing on mute for the time being.
Marut, you're on mute. We still can't hear you, Marut. Marut? Marut, you're still on mute. Marut? Marut, would you like to just give a short update?
So when we're just waiting for Dr. Krishnamurthy and Mr. Vivek Jory to join, there's a little bit of technical issue that Mr. Jory is facing in logging in. So in a minute or so, he should be there.
Okay.
Sir, Mr. Johuri has joined, sir. Chairman, Mr. Vivek Johuri has joined.
Yes, then it's okay. A very warm welcome, Mr. Johri, to you. So I would, without much ado, colleagues, I would start off the session. We are at 11:14. Mr. Krishnamurthy will be joining us soon. So a very warm welcome, Mr. Johri, who is
Thank
a
you.
member of
Thank you.
GST, IT, Tax Policy, CBIC. My name is Soumitra Bhattacharya. I'm the chairman of this committee, as well as the MD and CEO of Bosch India. Very, very warm welcome again, colleagues, to the CII National Conference on MNC. This is 2020. And thank you for joining and being a part of this, and which is under the aegis of the CII National Committee on MNCs. We would like to start the session in congratulating the government in bringing various reforms in taxation, liberalization in FDI policies, the very recent historic reform on simplification of agriculture, which is a very major thrust of the government, and seminal changes done in labor laws. Of course, the most welcome PLI scheme to boost the economy. All this will definitely help us to live and achieve the vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat. CII has been actively working with the government institutions and providing inputs and suggestions to the government for improving the business climate in India. The government has been kind enough to seek our suggestions and also work towards ensuring that all businesses, including MNCs, face lesser regulatory and infrastructural bottlenecks operating in the Indian soil. Today, the entry of foreign investors have been liberalized across sectors, and business environment across the state is improving sharply. We at CII MNC Committee have been a strong proponent of widening the scope of the MNC's participation in the Indian economy. History tells us India's relationship with MNCs is a lot deeper than one might expect or imagine. This is only to be expected since many of the MNCs are here for more than 100 years or nearly even 100 years. True, they've got a boost after the economic liberalization of 1991, but MNCs have stayed put even when times were tough. The laws were different and most of the businesses were then regulated. Their rapid emergence has played a pivotal role in the development of the country in numerous ways, like bridging gaps in domestic investment, inflow of superior technology, optimal utilization of resources, and contribution to the GDP. MNCs brought in the expertise, they adapted to Indian conditions, tailored their offerings, and marked them in a unique way. MNCs have also helped to grow the market in building ancillary industries and putting steps to the sales and marketing engines of the nation. We appreciate the fact that the Indian government recognizes the pivotal role played by MNCs. I call it a jugalbandi, where the MNCs also have in their agenda, Mr. Johri, the aspect of India agenda first. It's not just MNC agenda first. The conditions have greatly changed, and we can see it in the during and post-COVID area, where we want to have the best alternative investment destinations. And we want businesses at the MNC level especially to de-risk and diversify their supply chain operations on the +1 strategy. The reforms that the government have done are bearing fruit already. And we strongly believe that we can do this very strong jugalbandi between the government and the industry, and especially MNCs, on the Atmanirbhar aims to discuss the following. How do economic reforms benefit us? What needs to be done further to make the business environment even more conducive and hiring the bar? How MNCs can partner the government on an even stronger basis in the sphere of economic growth and development? So today, I would tell you that after this session, we have the second session on enabling policy environment for MNCs. Then we'll have 3 sectorial parallel sessions: doing business, e-commerce, e-business, and tapping investment potential in the financial sector. Finally, we'll have the closing session by our Honorable Finance Minister, Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman. So before I hand over the first session to the conference, it's my privilege and pleasure that CII, in association with Ernst & Young, has prepared a very crisp document on FDI, foreign direct investment in India, now, next and beyond, which will be released shortly. The report is based on primary surveys and secondary surveys that brings many interesting facts and figures with significant policy implications. It mentions future investment outlook in MNCs is encouraging. In 2 to 3 years, it is seen that more than 80% of the respondents have planned to make the investments in India as one of the top 3 choices in the global world. The report estimates that India has a potential to increase its annual FDI inflow to the range of 120 to 160 billion by 2025 US dollars. It suggested that the country should renew its emphasis on infrastructure development, faster clearances on projects, contract enforcement, and among a few of the host of key initiatives. It FDI spread across sectors and across states. Currently, we know, Mr. Johri, that 4 states are grabbing practically 80% of the investments. I would like to congratulate the ENY team led by Mr. Sudhir Kapadia, who's the moderator for the next session, and CII to bring this report. I would now request Mr. Vivek Johri to kindly join us in releasing the report. Sir, we will have to do an e-release and we'll be delighted if you please do it. Marut? Thank you very much, Mr. Johri, on behalf of both yourself as well as Dr. Subramaniam Swami, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramaniam, our Chief Economic Advisor. And this, I'm sure, Sudhir will take us through the FDI in India. I would again welcome everyone and look forward to very active presentation. Now, I would hand over to Mr. Sudhir Kapadia, who's the moderator, to take forward. Sudhir, the table is yours. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bhattacharya. Again, a warm welcome to Mr. Johri. The way we thought we would run this session is we will request the panelists, the key speakers, to give their main points, and basis the discussion, we will have the basis their respective points. We will have a discussion on some of the areas which are relevant for the topic on FDI investments in India. So with that, may I request Mr. Johri for your address to begin with, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kapadia, and a warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for inviting me to this session. I agreed to participate here because, and please don't get me wrong, but I'm a COVID warrior. I'm just recovering from a bout of COVID. But I was so tempted to address this conference because, these are very topical issues. I've been working on reforms for many years in various capacities in government, and this is a subject which is very dear to me. Very recently, I was holding charge of Nhava Sheva port as the Principal Chief Commissioner there, and there are a lot of customs reforms that we unleashed at Nhava Sheva. And so, I'm very happy to be here this morning and share my thoughts. I'll talk about tax reforms in indirect taxes, mainly customs and GST, because that is my area of work. But given the time constraint, it will have to be very broad brush strokes. So please, bear with me on that. Firstly, I want to say, although the government has focused sharply on improving India's ranking on EODB, actually the reforms go way beyond that and cover, multiple dimensions. As you would see, and as you would have noticed, if you've been following, the changes that we've been making in, various aspects of policy. The focus, as I see it, when I step back and look at the big picture, the focus, as I see it, at least based on my experience of indirect tax reform, is threefold. So the first is very important, which is how do we make these reforms an ongoing process? It's very clear, the thinking in government is very clear that these are not one-off reforms. These are not dependent on one single report, or one episode of reforms. We want to make these sustainable and an ongoing reform process. So one of the important things that has happened in recent years is that the government has been laying down very measurable outcomes, in different areas. For example, there are targets that have been fixed, informally though, of the kind of ranking we are looking or aspiring to be, to see ourselves in the EODB sphere. Then, as far as customs is concerned, there are very clear-cut targets on what should be the release time for release of cargo, which arrives by sea or by air and all of that. So there are very measurable targets which are being set for different agencies that are involved in implementing these reforms, and these are measured from time to time. And so there's a feedback loop, and our performance then is evaluated vis-a-vis the targets and how far we've got and what we need to do to get there faster. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second important thing is that now we've put in place a complete institutional mechanism, to look at these reforms and changes in an ongoing basis. For example, you have the National Trade Facilitation Committee on the customs side, which is chaired by the Cabinet Secretary himself, and which has participation of all the line ministries that are involved in implementation of reforms on the customs side, the logistics side of goods crossing the borders, and so that a unified policy can be involved. If there are wrinkles in the implementation process, then they can be ironed out. And whoever's involved in the implementation process, which is not just customs, but all border management agencies, they can all work together in a concerted way to achieve the outcomes. Likewise, on GST, the GST Council has been playing a very pivotal role in carrying forward reforms. They've constituted various committees, as you would have noticed, including the Law Committee, the Fitment Committee, and many other ad hoc committees also from time to time, to discuss what further changes we can make to improve the work environment in tax departments and GST. The other notable about these institutions is that they're very participative, with private sector and stakeholder participation in most of them. And there's a feedback loop which we've generated. So we keep getting feedback on whatever we think are doable and reforms that are desirable. And then depending on the feedback we've been sort of tweaking and making course corrections from time to time. And that's a very important aspect in order to make it an ongoing process. Another important thing which has happened, you would have noticed, is crowdsourcing of ideas. For the budget 21-22, for example, we're wanting to rewrite the customs law and to simplify it further. And we've crowdsourced ideas. We've got a lot of suggestions, thousands of them, and we're in the process of going through them, sifting through them to figure out, what is doable and what is not. The third important feature, and I said the focus is threefold, and the third one is that there's a lot of emphasis on use of technology. So when business process re-engineering, for improving the enabling environment, for customs clearances, for the working of GST, you would have noticed that there is a lot of focus on use of technology, whether it's IT, it could be artificial intelligence, it could even be machine learning for risk management. There are a whole lot of examples. On the customs side, for example, we've revamped our testing laboratories. We've got all of them NABL accreditation. There is specialization amongst these labs. We've installed a whole lot of container scanners in all the major seaports. We are using RFID seals for export cargo sealing. On the GST side, 2 or 3 very important technology leveraged reforms are e-way bills. For example, they've done away with check posts on the borders, e-invoicing for GST, which we introduced recently. So there's a whole lot of things which are leveraged on technology, and that is an important aspect of these reforms. Now, normally I would have expected that there would be a slowdown because of the COVID pandemic, and there would be a little bit of a setback to the reform process. But I'm happy to inform you that at least on the CBIC's work area, we've used it as an opportunity rather than an adversity to further spur reforms. And on the customs side, for example, we've adopted the threefold mantra of faceless, paperless, and contactless customs. So all business processes that required physical interface, if at all there was a residue, and there was, some of the business processes where importers or exporters needed to turn up physically to submit documents and to take permissions from customs, they've all been digitized. And the submission of documents is completely online, so they've all been electronically enabled. Personal hearings, which are a very important part of dispute settlement, have been shifted to a virtual mode at all levels in the customs department. And of course, the biggest reform, since time is short, and picking only on the very, very important and salient reforms, and perhaps unprecedented internationally, is the launch of faceless assessment on the customs side. And you would be aware that this involves off-site assessment of cargo. So regardless of where you import the cargo and where the documents are filed, on the availability of specialized manpower and the availability of manpower in general, the consignment could get assessed at a different location. What the faceless process also enables is that there is no physical contact between the importer or his broker and the assessing officer. And that itself will take care of a whole lot of problems that importers and brokers normally report. Now, so on the customs side, very broadly, that is the lay of the land. Apart from changes that we've made on the tariff side, and on tariffs, Mr. Bhattacharya mentioned Atmanirbhar Bharat in his opening remarks. And I must share with you that in the recent months, we've launched for a couple of items which are focus areas for the government, where we want to encourage domestic manufacturing. We've launched the phased manufacturing program, where we've recalibrated tariffs for certain end products and their inputs in raw materials and components, so as to enable a graded tariff structure, which allows value addition to take place in India rather than import finished products directly from abroad. So the phased manufacturing program is an example of that. And of course, over a period of time, we've already put in place a graded tariff structure where the duty gets escalated as you move from basic raw materials to intermediates to components and then finished products. So that is also an important change on the tariff side, and we continue to sort of identify more and more areas apart from the production-linked incentive scheme, which Mr. Bhattacharya talked about. This phased manufacturing program is also an important contributor to the Atmanirbhar Bharat theme. What is important about the phased manufacturing program, another important point I want to make, is that these are time-bound tariff changes. And the calendar is notified in advance. So the industry and the investors are aware well in advance about the longevity of these tariff changes and recalibrations, so that they can sort of plan production and their logistics accordingly. That's an important change from the past, where these tended to be open-ended and uncertain in terms of timelines. What we've been able to achieve, of course, is there in the public domain, and the TAB rankings of India, in the World Bank survey improved from 146 in 2017 to 80 in 2018. That was one of the largest leaps that any country made in the World Bank survey in 1 year's time. And it improved further to 68 in 2019. Now that's an improvement of 78 ranks in 2 years. That's a very significant improvement in my view. Also be happy to note, and I'm quoting from the DBR 2020. DBR 2021 has been suspended, as you're aware. So the last results we have are of DBR 2020. I'm happy to point out, many of you would already have noticed, that the average release time for import cargo, as measured by the EODB survey, was 85 hours for India. And I just want to benchmark it for you. Compared to Southeast Asia, it was almost half. It was 179 hours for Southeast Asia. It was only 85 hours for India. Of course, I must also tell you in the same breath that for OECD countries, it was 12 hours. Now, we have been given a target of, achieving a release time of 48 hours for imports. And I do want to assure you that we're working in a very concerted way to get on the export side also, we're doing much better than Southeast Asia in general. And according to DBR 2020, we clocked an average release time of 64 hours, which of course is much higher than the target we set for ourselves, which was only 24 hours, compared to 127 hours for Southeast Asia. So again, it's about half of what it is for a comparable sample of Southeast Asian countries. But of course, it is a multiple of what it is for OECD, which is about 15 hours. So we have a long way to go, but I think the reforms that have been set in place are irreversible, and therefore we are moving in the right direction. You are aware that there are many agencies that are involved with the border, and so we all have to work in a concerted way to get there, which we're doing. And there's been very large-scale changes amongst the participating government agencies to our single window project also, which I don't have time to talk about right now, but it's already happening. On the GST side, there is just two major reforms I want to touch upon. One of the biggest concerns which businesses were flagging to us on the implementation of GST was the heavy compliance burden, particularly in the area of return filing. And there are two major changes the government have introduced in order to deal with that problem squarely. So we're about to launch what is known as the Quarterly Return Monthly Payment Scheme, QRMP, for taxpayers below a certain threshold of turnover. So these are taxpayers having a turnover up to 5 crores per annum, which is the current definition of MSMEs, in our context. And so for MSMEs that account for 89% of the total taxpayer population, 89% of the total taxpayer population of 1.2 crore, we are going to have a system where the return filing is going to be quarterly rather than monthly. And just look at the kind of saving in terms of compliance burden and time and effort that is going to mean for businesses. So 89% of the taxpayers would be allowed to pay their tax liabilities on a monthly basis, but they can file returns on a quarterly basis. Of course, the one concern that had arisen in this context was whether it will work against the objective of encouraging MSMEs to supply to large businesses, because their monthly, their returns will be quarterly, and whether they'll be able to pass on input tax credit or not. We've taken care of that, and we're going to have a continuous filing facility for MSMEs during the quarter, so that they can upload their invoices on the system, and their buyers can take credit of those invoices. So this QRMP will eliminate from monthly, filing of returns 89% of the taxpayers. The other major improvement is for everybody who's filing monthly returns, and you would be aware the GST law stipulated three different returns for taxpayers: GSTR 1, 2, and 3, to deal with the outward supplies, the input tax credit part, which is covered by 2, and the final liability, which was covered by 3. Now, these had to be from the 10th to 20th of every month. Businesses had raised the concern that they were busy just filing GST returns and verifying them, And, there was a lot of toing and froing between suppliers and their buyers and all of that, resulting in a lot of investment in terms of time and effort for businesses. Now, that was obviously a very major concern, which complicated the implementation on GST and added to the compliance burden. Now, we've tried to address this. The GST Council at its 32nd meeting had approved, in principle, a return enhancement and advance program, under which we are going to now go for 3 returns, this thing, of course. But the good part is that GSTR1, which is the outward supply return, will be used to auto-populate the other 2 returns, which businesses had earlier to file. And what this would mean is that just filing of 1 return, by the supplier and discharging of his liability would enable the entire return cycle to get triggered. And, for buyers to be able to see what are their ITC, what is the ITC availability for them, and then to plan and discharge their liability through 3B, which will again be auto-populated. So that is a very significant development, I think, and a very major reform that we're introducing. Part of it is already out there. So in August, for example, we allowed monthly taxpayers, we allowed this facility of GSTR1 auto-populating 2B. Now what we've done is we are able to show through a PDF document on the 13th month, a taxpayer will be able to see what is the ITC availability to him. And based on that, on the 20th of the month, he can discharge his liability through filing of 3B. Also, the liability data would travel directly from GSTR1 to 3B of every taxpayer. So this is a very significant improvement in the current return filing system. And of course, with the launch of e-invoice, which, as you're aware, we've currently made mandatory for taxpayers who have an aggregate turnover of about 500 crore, and which we're going to gradually bring down. What will happen is that you may not even need to file any returns. And if you've been generating your e-invoices on the system, then those e-invoices will be used to generate your return over a period of time. And that will be a very, very major improvement of the current system. Just to share one data bit, in the month of November, we had almost 20 lakh filings of e-invoices per day, which is a very large number, and the system is able to take that load and to enable that. So those are some of the major changes, and since time is short, I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to sort of answer any queries that your participants may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Johri. And Mr. Bhattacharya, if you want to please come in to introduce.
Yes, please.
The
Thank you, Sudhir. A very, very warm welcome to you, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, our Chief Economic Advisor. So we are very happy to have you with us, along with Mr. Vivek Johri. And every time we meet you, there are a new set of reforms. Last time, the seminal changes on labor, and in between already the PLI. So we look forward to even more and discussions. Over to our moderator and chair for this session, Sudhir Kapadia. Please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bhattacharya, and again a warm welcome, Mr. Subramanian, to just what Mr. Bhattacharya said. Actually, if we read your last 2 years economic surveys, I can easily see at least 4 to 5 very concrete recommendations which have found acceptance by the government, and we are obviously very happy with that development, whether it is the MSME definitional changes, or labor sector reforms, or agriculture, and the PLI which Chairman mentioned. Look forward to hearing your views today, and also look forward to some more reforms which are there in your recommendations in the economic survey reports in the days and weeks to come. Over to you, Mr. Subramanian.
Very good morning, and thank you very much for that warm introduction. Let me thank the organizers for inviting me to share my thoughts. Yes, I must say it's been very gratifying to see the zeal for reforms, that has come about after the COVID. I just wanted to share with you, the thinking behind this, and also lay out what we are working on. So one of the key ways in which COVID has, as an economic crisis that it created, is different from previous economic crisis. It is important to understand, and that is, in fact, what is driving the economic agenda, especially the reform agenda. So, if you looked at a typical emerging economy crisis. And I think the 2013 taper tantrum is an excellent example of this. Typically, the crisis used to be one of overheating of the economy, where imports would far exceed would far exceed exports. So the domestic demand would be in far excess of domestic supply, and therefore that had to be filled in through through a lot of imports, which would then be reflected in a very fastly accelerating current account deficit. For instance, during the taper tantrum, the current account deficit touched about 6%. The other key change that happens during such crisis is that inflation really shoots up, and inflation shoots up from demand side factors, not as much from supply side factors. For instance, during the taper tantrum, the inflation was in high double digits. Now, that's what a typical emerging economy crisis was. In contrast, the COVID crisis is different, and one of the things that in India, I think we did well was to identify the nature of this crisis and understand how it is different from other emerging economy crises, so that the response thereby can be suitably crafted. And this is that the COVID crisis is a crisis to demand primarily. It was a shock to demand, negative shock to demand, and that is, in fact, if you can see, is reflected in the fact that this year we may be having a current account surplus. Q1 we had almost a $20 billion current account surplus, $19.8 billion to be precise. And even if, let's say, subsequent quarters do not see that kind of performance, we still will have likely a current account surplus. Together with the emphasis on Atmanirbhar Bharat, and the behavioral change that is being attempted, I will have something to say on that Atmanirbhar Bharat part, especially in the context of trade a little later. But right now, if you focus on so current account surplus, what that actually means is that the main risk from COVID, which we recognized, was one that it actually might impact growth. Short run, of course, there was going to be an impact because of lockdowns, etc. But a bigger aspect that we wanted to really understand and make sure that we were not impacted by it was the medium to long term impact on growth because of COVID. So in some sense, compared to a normal emerging economy crisis, which is one of overheating of the economy, the COVID crisis is one of underheating of the economy. And that is why, the reforms actually were felt very, very necessary, so that the medium to long-term growth of the economy is not impacted, and, that the potential growth of the economy is kept high. So I think that has been the key spirit behind these reforms. Of course, it also, a lot of credit to those who eventually make the decisions for having the political will to be able to launch these reforms. It's one thing for economists like us to say, another thing for the actual decision makers to do it. And so, the credit really needs to go to them for having the political will to do these reforms. Because in a country like India, the reality is that there is always, there are various stakeholders, and reforms usually create a tension between the the silent majority that benefits from the reforms, and a vocal minority that potentially can lose out from reforms, or continues or can benefit from status quo, and therefore has an incentive to influence the perpetuation of status quo. So in that sense, this aspect, or this notion that reforms require consensus, I think by definition, or tautologically, it is difficult to have consensus. It's important to actually place the interests of the silent majority, typically those that are less privileged than the vocal minority, place their interests, primary in being able to launch those reforms. So that is something which one must commend. So which is what has actually led to these reforms. I think just a few details on the labor reforms, how I think that will impact on the broader macro economy. Firstly, as many of you by now, I think, know, 41 laws have been condensed into 4. The number of sections has been reduced by 60%. Number of sections reduced by 60%, I think, which is significant. The number of minimum wages, for instance, which were in excess of 2,200, now have been brought to 40, from about 2,200 to 40. So you can imagine the compliance, easing that happens, because having to comply with more than 2,200 minimum wages would have definitely been very, very difficult for you all. Now bringing that down to 40 is one other aspect. There are, the enabling of the full-time equivalent, which thereby provides you the flexibility to, cater employment to demand conditions, and thereby removes the fear for you to hire. Which is that, if we hire, will we be able to actually calibrate, if demand goes down? I think that fear goes away, and therefore you can focus on hiring more people in the formal sector, which in turn actually helps to create significant demand in the economy. So that is something. And, recognizing the fact that we had a lot of dwarfs among the MSME sector, dwarfs, basically firms that had aged but had not grown, had continued to remain small. Therefore, the PLI scheme, of course, is a manifestation of that idea. The MSME definitional changes are also a manifestation of that idea. But even the labor law changes, the thresholds themselves are also a manifestation of that idea. For instance, the thresholds for defining a factory has been increased from 10 employees to 20 employees. For contract workers, law to be applicable, that threshold has been changed from 20 employees to 50 employees, and for standing orders to be applicable, the threshold has been changed from 100 to 300. All these are actually ways to enable economies of scale, especially among MSMEs, which will help to create jobs and thereby demand in the economy. So I think these are very important reforms, together with the agriculture reforms. When I look at the macroeconomic story behind this, I think there are 2 key themes that are running in this. One is a significant thrust towards formalization of the economy. Mr. Vivek Johri was talking about the changes on the tax side. When you look at the IBC, you look at the RERA, a lot of the shell companies, etc., being tracked down. The increase in formal sector employment, something that we had covered in the economic survey. For instance, salaried class, when you compare 2011-12 to 2017-18, the number of salaried workers increased by 5%, over 2 crores. And this was a change from casual labor to salaried class. So the formalization that is being done actually is important. And that is, particularly crucial, because formal sector firms actually are far more resilient to shocks than informal sector firms. And within the last 10 years, if you see, the global financial crisis and the COVID crisis has shown that crises that actually are beyond anyone's control is something that may be here to stay. to stay, and therefore building resilience in the economy by enabling formalization is extremely important. A second important theme is that if you take the agriculture reforms, the MSME definitional changes, the PLI scheme, the labor reforms, all these together, it is an attempt to actually, change the macro configuration of the economy towards those sectors that are more, employment intensive, especially the primary and secondary sectors. Primary sector is agriculture, secondary sector is manufacturing. Now, this is important because if we need sustained growth to happen, that can only happen through, robust job creation in the economy, not through jobless growth. Jobless growth episodes actually peter out, while growth that actually is accompanied through job creation is the one that actually puts money in the hands of people, creates demand thereby for products and services that companies like yours manufacture, and thereby create sustained growth. So the focus on the primary and secondary sectors of the economy is primarily to actually enable sustained growth by changing this macroeconomic configuration towards sectors that are far more employment intensive. One of the things that early on when I took on this role, I looked at was that if you last 30, almost 50 years, a lot of our growth has not been as employment intensive, and that is something that we actually need to change, for sustained growth to happen by creating demand. Because, if you look at countries across the world, and one of the things that we had done for the 2019 economic survey, looked at, countries that had grown at 5% minimum, for at least a decade. In other words, high growth for a long enough period of time. What stood out was that it actually was wage-driven, increases in wages, increase in employment, and thereby actually disposable income being created in the hands of people. And that's what led to that sustained growth. Of course, investment actually helped in that process significantly. So that is the other key theme, which is formalization to both enable growth of the economy, but also build resilience, and to actually enable a lot more employment intensive growth, in the economy, so that the growth can be sustained. So those are primarily the sort of the key ideas behind the current reform attempt. Recognizing that we don't want COVID to create any permanent impact on the economy. In fact, if anything, by converting the crisis into an opportunity, we want to really push the economy further. Last bit, and I'll stop after this, which is sometimes there are some concerns about about the interpretation of Atmanirbhar Bharat as self-sufficiency. I think it is important to distinguish between self-reliance, which is what Atmanirbhar means in Hindi, and self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency has this notion of, Robinson Crusoe, caught in an island, plucking coconuts and using that to trade for fish. And that's what self-sufficiency is about. In contrast, self-reliance is one which actually is built on capabilities. If you look at individuals or firms or countries, self-reliance never ever gets built without capabilities. And capabilities themselves are built through competition. This has been, one of the things that I think, all of us who had the opportunity to go to the best institutions, in India and across the world, I recognize that capabilities are only built by having the toughest competition, and therefore, self-reliance cannot be built by undermining competition. But at the same time, it is also important to recognize that having a 5-year-old actually go and compete with a 21-year-old is not fair competition either. And that is why, as Mr. Johri was mentioning, the tariff changes actually have a pronounced timeline to it, so that this infant industry syndrome that had been the arguments had been given earlier but without actually implementation of that, a 5-year-old cannot continue to be a 5-year-old. In 16 years, the 5-year-old has to become a 21-year-old, and that recognition and therefore the grandfathering is important, which is what is underlying the idea of building self-reliance through competition, but at the same time fair competition. Overall, as someone who's actually quite optimistic about the economy, and in fact, even during the really difficult times amidst COVID, I continue to be optimistic about the economy, more so now given some of the frequent indicators that are high frequency indicators that are coming in. So I'll stop there on that optimistic note. I think the reforms push actually is really enabling. And I think some of the V-shaped recovery that we are seeing is also helping us in the short run. Thank you very much for inviting me once again to share my thoughts. And I wish all of you good health during this time. Please do take care and follow all the COVID norms so that we can get through to January or February with the least damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanian. And indeed, we agree with you that you did lay out a torch of optimism, even in the worst of the pandemic times earlier, when the news on the economic front was not that good, and with cogent reasoning. I do remember listening to you time and again in those times. I just have one quick question, a follow-up question to what you said in terms of some of the other recommendations I alluded to in your excellent economic survey dissectations, is on the contractual enforcement, whereas we still lag behind in the ease of doing business rankings. And you had one excellent suggestion, I thought, which is to say, by a fairly straightforward augmentation of judicial capacity at the lower court levels, a lot of the pending matters and a lot of the future dispute resolutions can be handled more effectively. Just your thoughts on that, and do you think that is something which we can expect to see some action soon? Sorry, you have to unmute, Dr. Subramanian. You are on mute.
Sorry. So sorry for it's on mute. No, a short response to that. What has to be done has been laid out very clearly. It needs to be done.
All right, we'll leave it as that, and I request Mr. Bhattacharya to press some of these points through the chamber as well, and hope to get those out. At this stage, may I request? At this stage, may I request Mr. Bali for your thoughts, especially in view of what the CEA and Mr. Johri have already covered, and then we can open it up for some questions, please.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Kapadia. Thank you, Dr. Subramaniam and Mr. Johri, for very cogent already said, but I would like to really the much needed impetus and the renewed focus to the manufacturing sector, given the heightened emphasis on diversification of global supply chains amidst the pandemic. This is in fact an opportune time to attract new investments to bolster our manufacturing sector from the current stagnation at about 16% of GDP to about 25%. Clearly, to my mind, it is India's manufacturing moment. Over the last 5 years, there has been the much needed opening of the economy, and as previous speakers have mentioned, I will not repeat those. I think many of the reforms have been game-changing in nature. But as is usually the case in this highly competitive world, there is always a demand for further improvement in many areas. From an MNC lens, I see three major drivers of investment by MNC into a country or a geography. Number one, a strategic fit. Number two, a business case fit. And number three, the operational fit. So when it comes to strategic fit, it is based more on largely geopolitical and long-term consideration the location, the country stability, the approach to holistic sustainability, transparency, and human rights. Number two, the business fit is clearly a prime motivator based on cost and availability of raw materials, market access and product fit, and market size, talent availability. And the third piece, which is operational fit, is something directly connected to ease of doing business and cost of doing business, which is, as Mr. Kapadia rightly mentioned, today speedier disposal of legal matters and contract enforcement is a key issue. More clarity and stability on tax matters, cost and availability of land, labor, energy, and capital. So, where do we as a nation stand on these three top considerations is what we need to analyze. And I think we've done fairly well. Some of the points which are outstanding is contract enforcement. We are talking of logistics and infrastructure, which needs constant upgradation. But coming to the taxation system becoming more friendly, I will make a quick reference to 5 or 6 areas requiring government's attention. Number one, the recent changes to customs procedures on import from FTA countries. Now, practically, this is posing a lot of challenges in terms of customs clearance of goods and causing inordinate. So I think this needs immediate attention, as otherwise this will be seen as an impediment in operations and will seriously impact the ease of doing business. Number two, fast track bilateral APAs. The APA mechanism is indeed outstanding, but however, there are several APAs not concluded even after completion of 5 years. This will defeat the very purpose of APA and create unpredictability in taxation. Number three, conflict between transfer pricing and customs. I think government has to look at this, both work in opposite directions. So I think we need to really look at that. Number four, dispute resolution for tax litigations. Now, as on December 2019, there are 9 lakh crore worth of disputed tax under direct tax and which are stuck in litigations. Mediation methods prevailing in major economies may kindly be considered so that we can quickly sort them out. Number 5, GST reforms. I think Mr. Johari has already mentioned a lot, but just one request, rate rationalization has become crucial, particularly in the wake of COVID impact on economy. For instance, commercial vehicles and passenger buses are at the highest slab of luxury goods tax at about 28%. So we need to have a look. And finally, the sixth point which I wanted to mention was incentive on services exports, SCIS. MNCs have created large employment through global capability centers, GCCs, and there is certain incentives promised. These incentives are not being released on time. So I think these are some of the quick things. I don't want to take too long, but in conclusion, I must submit that there is, with the bold reforms by the government, there is an increasing interest in the India story, more so post the breakout of the pandemic. Also, the presence of a large number of reputed MNCs for decades adds to credibility of India's story. And for most MNCs, when it comes to operating principles, it is India first, as India has become the home market for many of us. So I will stop there. I will not take too long. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Back to you, Mr. Kapadia.
Thank you, Mr. Bali, and also some of the taxation points I think are very relevant, and we certainly will take those forward as well. In the interest of time, we may not have too many questions which we can ask, but if I can just request one other viewpoint stroke question from Mr. Pramod Sant from Siemens, if you are there. Mr. Sant?
Yes. Yeah. Good afternoon. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. My question is to Mr. Johari. Mr. Johari, we are really thankful for the various reforms which custom has done in the last 2-3 years, and it definitely helped to create a good image about Indian system, our principles, and for multinationals. How entire development you need a full basket. I am quite sure that normal imports or exports which are vanilla, they are able to do very fast. However, for a complete growth, you always need a complete basket like second-hand, temporary tools, samples, R&D samples, and job work plus some software development. So whereas all other these activities, they are still having the old a little unreliable and variation from port to port. So how are you able to really look into this area to make it very simple for companies so that they are able to do a growth in all areas? There is a lot of potential to create jobs into this area for testing, analysis purpose in India, where the Indian skill set is available. So this is my one question. And second is to land customs reforms, particularly exports to Nepal. These are very time taking. So can we look into this to make it the same way as how I can do in Mumbai? I should be able to do it for Bangladesh also. So these are my. Thank you.
Sure. Mr. Johri, may I request you if you could respond, and also the couple of points which Mr. Bali had made, if you are able to give your views there, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that feedback. Of course, some of the points which Mr. Bali made pertain to direct taxes, and, I would not stick my neck out on those. But definitely on GST reforms, on FTAs, I would like to make a couple of points. On FTAs, there's a very limited intervention that we've done through the Karutar rules. And actually, it's meant to protect bona fide importers, who are importing under FTAs. And it's meant to make sure that only goods that pass muster in terms of value addition and, the local content requirements, etc., prescribed under the rules of origin, that are actually coming in. The concern was that from some of the FTAs at least, we noticed that goods that were coming in were not satisfying the value addition norms. And so it is to check and verify some of these cases that, we've done some interventions under the Karutar rules. If you look at the overall percentage, it is not significant at all in terms of consignments or in terms of value where these interventions have been made. And of course, initially there was a bit of a backlog which had developed. But as and when, we're talking to our trading partners who are involved, and we're getting these cases verified as expeditiously as possible. So hopefully in future, the industry would not have this complaint about Karutar interventions coming in the way of EODB. Rate rationalization on GST, I'm sure you're all aware that the GST Council is involved, and there are many times when they've sat down and looked at rate rationalization. It is bound to happen sooner or later, and the point which Mr. Bali has made, I've taken note of. Coming to Mr. Sant's point, second-hand capital goods, job work, repairs, testing, I agree with him that the provisions that are currently there in place are somewhat outmoded and need to be revamped. Having looked at the major chunk of imports and exports and reform those processes, this is the obvious next stage in our reform process which we need to look at. Likewise, on land customs reforms, there are two parts that I want to mention. One is revamping the infrastructure, where a lot of work has already happened at the land customs station. The second part is revisiting the business processes, and that is also being looked at. I think very shortly we'll have some paper out on, or some thinking is already happening on how we need to automate. The automation is already happening, but whether we need to revisit the business processes. But I think the problem with land customs has more to do with infrastructure than with business processes. So I think those are my brief responses to the points made. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johri. Much appreciated. And I must commend the earlier point which you made in your address on having a targeted reduction in the processing time on imports and exports. That is very encouraging. That is also one of the points which has come in our MNC survey, which Chairman talked about in the beginning. So this would be very, very good to achieve. With this, may I now request Chairman Bhattacharya to take over and tell us about the next session, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sudhir, for an excellent moderation in a very limited and defined period. And thank you very much to our two eminent speakers, along with our homegrown Mr. Kamal Bali. But Mr. Johri, thank you for you being with us. Crisp, brevity, clarity, and with very clear data points. Thank you very much, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramaniam, for, as always, an excellent talk, and more importantly, your seminal changes that you're making. Our next session, colleagues, thanks to Mr. Kabadia's excellent starting absolutely on time, is the preliminary session enabling policy environment for MNCs, aligning MNCs with government goal of Atmanirbhar Bharat, as well as promoting industry-government partnership for enhancing MNCs' contribution to Indian economy. So we are just waiting for Marut to give us a confirmation. I understand we will have